It was fast, it was sleek, and when its jagged silhouette appeared against the clouds, even the most experienced Allied pilots felt that cold rush of fear. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 wasn't just another fighter plane. It was a statement, a warning, a machine built for domination at a time when the world was about to tear itself apart. When the Bf 109 first took off in the mid-1930s, few outside Germany realized just how revolutionary it was. The rest of the world's fighters were still clunky, open cockpit relics of the First World War, made of fabric, wood, and wishful thinking. But the Bf 109 looked like it came from another planet. It was made entirely of metal with retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, and a powerful Daimler-Benz engine that turned the small aircraft into a bullet with wings. To the Reich's top brass, it was the perfect symbol of a new Germany, precise, ruthless, and ahead of its time. And while the world's attention was still focused on the crumbling peace of Europe, engineers in Augsburg were secretly crafting a fighter that would soon rule the skies. The first time the Allies encountered the Bf 109 in combat, many didn't know what hit them. Pilots reported that it could climb faster, dive steeper, and pull out of turns with frightening agility. It wasn't just the speed, it was the way it moved, smooth, efficient, almost alive. British and French pilots who faced it during the early campaigns of World War II came back with stories that sounded unreal. Dogfights that lasted seconds, opponents vanishing into the sun, guns that spat fire at impossible angles. What made the 109 truly terrifying, though, wasn't just its engineering. It was the attitude it represented. It was Germany's declaration that air combat would never be the same again. This wasn't a defensive aircraft. It was built to hunt. The sleek nose, the narrow wings, even the scream of its engine at full throttle, everything about it was designed to intimidate and destroy. But behind that engineering brilliance was a darker story of obsession, competition, and propaganda. The Luftwaffe needed a weapon that could shock the world, and Messerschmitt was determined to deliver it, no matter the cost. Engineers pushed limits, cutting corners on safety to squeeze out speed. Test pilots whispered about dangerous stalls and sudden engine failures. Risks brushed aside in the race to outfly every rival nation. And by the time the world finally realized what Germany had built, it was too late. The Bf 109 was already rewriting the rules of air warfare, and its legend, or its infamy, was only beginning. Because this wasn't just a fighter plane, it was a symbol of fear, precision, and ambition. A machine that made the sky itself feel dangerous. But how did this deadly creation come to life in the first place? The answer lies in the rivalry, secrecy, and raw genius that gave birth to the most feared fighter of its time. The story of the Bf 109's creation doesn't start in the skies. It starts in a world still recovering from one war and secretly preparing for the next. Germany in the 1930s was not even supposed to have an air force. The Treaty of Versailles made sure of that. But deep inside hidden workshops and disguised research centers, engineers were already working on something extraordinary. At the heart of it was Willy Messerschmitt, a man who saw airplanes not just as machines, but as extensions of human will. Messerschmitt had a vision, a fighter that was light, aerodynamic, and fast enough to dominate anything in the air. He didn't believe in brute force. He believed in efficiency. Every curve, every rivet, every inch of metal had to serve a purpose. That philosophy clashed with almost everyone around him. The German Air Ministry wanted something heavier, sturdier, more traditional. They thought his designs were too fragile, too risky. But Messerschmitt had an advantage. He knew that speed was everything. In air combat, a fraction of a second could mean life or death, and he was building a plane that would own that fraction. His early prototype, the Bf-109 V1, looked like nothing else in the sky. It was slim, almost minimalist, a knife made of aluminum. Under the hood, a British-made Rolls-Royce engine powered the first test flights. Ironically, the plane that would soon terrorize British pilots took off for the first time with a British heart. The tests were promising, but not without danger. Pilots described how the aircraft felt nervous, reacting to every tiny movement on the controls. But when it moved right, it flew. It cut through the air with a precision no other aircraft could match. And once Messerschmitt's team swapped in the new Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, the Bf-109's personality changed completely. It wasn't just fast. It was viciously fast. Meanwhile, Germany's political machine saw its potential. The Luftwaffe was being rebuilt in secret, and they needed a flagship, something that would announce Germany's return to power. Messerschmitt's design fit perfectly, but behind the scenes, his rivalry with other designers, especially Ernst Heinkel, grew bitter. The Air Ministry played them against each other, promising contracts to whoever could deliver the best fighter. It became more than engineering, it was personal. The result of that rivalry was innovation under pressure. Messerschmitt refined, stripped down, and re-engineered every component until the Bf-109 became a masterpiece of lethal simplicity. It could be built quickly, repaired easily, and pushed to limits few pilots dared to test. When it finally went into production, nobody could have guessed what this small, elegant fighter would become, or how long it would rule the air. But the whispers had already begun. There's a new machine in the sky and nothing can touch it. Still, a design on paper means nothing without battle, and the Bf-109 would soon get its first real test, one that would shock the world and prove that Messerschmitt's creation wasn't just another plane. It was a predator. Before the world was thrown into full-scale war, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 got its first taste of blood in a little-known conflict that became its testing ground, the Spanish Civil War. It was 1937, and Europe was still pretending peace could last. But over the skies of Spain, the future of aerial combat was already being decided. Germany, supporting General Franco's forces, quietly sent the newly formed Condor Legion, a volunteer unit that was anything but unofficial. Their secret weapon, a handful of prototype Bf-109s, sleek and unproven. This was no ordinary war. It was an experiment, a laboratory of death where tactics, weapons, and machines were tested in real combat. The Luftwaffe needed data, and Spain became their testing field. The early 109s faced Soviet-built Polikarpov fighters flown by Republican pilots. Those Soviet planes were good, nimble, battle-tested, and dangerous, but the Bf-109 was something else entirely. Reports from the front were astonishing. The 109s climbed faster, dove steeper, and escaped when outnumbered. German pilots discovered they could choose when to fight and when to disappear, a luxury their opponents didn't have. It was the first time in history that speed and altitude truly decided a dogfight. And with every mission, the Bf-109 was quietly rewriting the rules of air warfare. But Spain also exposed the aircraft's dark side. Pilots complained about its narrow landing gear, great for aerodynamics, terrible for takeoffs. Many crashes happened not in combat, but on the runway. The engine's torque was so powerful that young pilots often lost control the second the wheels left the ground. Still, for every complaint, there was awe. The 109 didn't just fly, it performed. It was demanding, unforgiving, but if you mastered it, you owned the sky. The data from Spain convinced the Luftwaffe that they had something revolutionary. By the time the world heard the name Messerschmitt, the 109 had already proven itself in secret. When war officially erupted in 1939, the Bf 109 was ready, not as a prototype, but as a predator that had already tasted victory. During the invasion of Poland, its dominance became undeniable. Polish PZL fighters couldn't compete. The Luftwaffe swept the skies clean in days. Then came France and the Low Countries, fast, brutal campaigns where the 109s escorted bombers and tore through enemy squadrons. Allied pilots began to whisper about this mysterious machine with the shark-like nose that seemed untouchable in the air. By mid-1940, the Bf 109 wasn't just Germany's best fighter. It was the most feared aircraft in the world. It had gone from prototype to legend in under 5 years. And, for the first time, the Allies realized they weren't just facing a better army. They were facing a better machine. But the true test was still ahead. Across the English Channel, a new kind of enemy was waiting, one with faster planes, better training, and unbreakable spirit. The Bf 109's reputation would be put to its ultimate test in the battle that defined air warfare itself, the Battle of Britain. By the summer of 1940, Europe belonged to Germany. France had fallen in weeks, the Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable, and the Luftwaffe's pilots were riding high on victory after victory. But across the narrow English Channel, one nation refused to bow. The skies above Britain were about to become the deadliest proving ground in aviation history, and at the center of it all was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The 109 entered the Battle of Britain not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of Nazi confidence. It had already crushed opposition in Poland, Norway, and France. To the Luftwaffe, this was just another campaign, a final step before forcing Britain to surrender. On paper, the Bf 109E Emil variant had everything it needed to dominate: a top speed of nearly 350 miles per hour, lethal twin cannons, and an engine that could climb like nothing else in the sky. Allied pilots called it the Black Cross, a dark shape that struck terror the moment it appeared in the sun. When combat began, that fear was justified. In the early dogfights, the 109s shredded British squadrons. They were faster than the Hurricane, more agile than early Spitfires, and their Daimler-Benz engines allowed them to perform daring vertical climbs that caught enemies off guard. German aces like Adolf Galland and Werner Milders racked up kills at a staggering pace, becoming living legends of the air. Some British pilots joked grimly that the Bf 109 could outrun death itself. But soon the cracks began to show. The 109 was powerful, but it was also trapped by its own design. Operating from bases in France, it had just 10 minutes of combat time over southern England before it had to turn back for fuel. Every minute in the fight was a countdown to disaster. British pilots quickly learned to use this weakness, drag the fight out, stay defensive, and wait for the Germans to run low on gas. Then there was the enemy they hadn't truly faced before, the Spitfire. It wasn't faster in a straight line, but in a turn fight, it could dance around the 109 like a phantom. The two machines became equals in the air, speed versus agility, power versus precision. Every duel was a contest, not just of engineering, but of nerve. The Bf 109 still terrified anyone who faced it head-on. Its 20mm cannons could rip a Spitfire apart in a single burst. Yet the longer the battle dragged on, the more the balance shifted. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's invincible weapon was bleeding losses. British pilots began returning home alive and victorious. By October 1940, the Battle of Britain ended in a way no one expected. The Bf-109 had fought brilliantly, but it couldn't win a war it wasn't built for. It had reached the edge of its range, and perhaps the edge of its legend. Still, among both friend and foe, the respect was undeniable. Even Allied pilots admitted, when you saw that angular nose and heard the scream of its engine, your heart skipped a beat. Because the 109 didn't just fight battles, it defined them. But Germany wasn't ready to give up its greatest weapon. The engineers went back to the drawing board, determined to evolve the 109 into something even deadlier, a machine that could face the growing Allied threat head-on. And what came next would push the Bf-109, and the men who flew it, to their absolute limits. When the smoke cleared over Britain, one truth became painfully obvious. Even the most feared machine in the sky could be beaten. The Bf-109 had dominated early battles, but now the Luftwaffe faced something new. A long war, spreading across multiple fronts and enemies that refused to back down. The Battle of Britain had exposed weaknesses that couldn't be ignored. The 109's short range, narrow landing gear, and cramped cockpit made it difficult to handle on long missions. Allied aircraft were catching up fast, both in performance and numbers. If the Bf-109 was going to remain Germany's weapon of terror, it had to evolve, and evolve fast. That transformation began with the Bf-109F, known as the Friedrich. To many pilots, this was the purest version of the fighter, the one that finally felt complete. The Friedrich was sleeker, lighter, and more aerodynamic. Engineers refined the wings, smoothed out the fuselage, and boosted the power of its Daimler-Benz DB601N engine. The result? A fighter that could hit 390 miles per hour and dance through the sky with uncanny grace. Pilots fell in love with it instantly. Even Allied pilots who faced it admitted that the F model was a masterpiece, smooth to handle, beautifully balanced, and terrifyingly quick. It didn't just fly, it flowed. German ace Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, would go on to score more than 150 victories flying a Bf-109F. He described it as the perfect partner, responsive, lethal, and alive in his hands. But perfection never lasts long in war. As the Allies adapted, the Bf-109 had to change again. The Gustav, the Bf-109G series, was born out of necessity. The Luftwaffe needed more power to climb higher and fight bombers. The Gustav got a stronger engine, heavier armament, and reinforced armor. It could now destroy American B-17s, but that strength came at a cost. The once graceful 109 was now heavier, less agile, and harder to control. Pilots began calling it the Bully, strong but unpredictable. Still, the Luftwaffe pushed it to its limits. By 1943, the 109 was everywhere, defending German cities, fighting over the deserts of North Africa, and dueling Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. It was stretched thin, but it kept evolving. The G6, G10, and finally the K4, the Kurfürst, a desperate attempt to squeeze every last ounce of performance from an aging design. Each new model came with the same haunting question: how long could it keep up? Allied planes like the P-51 Mustang and Spitfire Menke 9 were faster, more reliable, and better armed. The once dominant Predator was becoming the hunted, but for the men who flew it, the 109 was more than a machine. It was a challenge, a test of skill, and sometimes a death sentence. They respected it, even feared it, because it demanded everything from them. The evolution of the Bf-109 wasn't just a technical story. It was a reflection of Germany's war itself. Brilliant at first, desperate in the end, and held together by determination. Yet, through every version, every upgrade, one thing never changed. When a Bf-109 roared overhead, pilots still looked up. because even in its final form, the Black Cross fighter refused to die quietly. But to understand why pilots still talk about it with awe, and sometimes with dread, we have to hear their stories firsthand. What was it really like to fly the most feared machine of the early war skies? To understand why the Bf-109 became legendary, you have to see it through the eyes of the men who flew it. For them, this machine wasn't just metal and bolts. It was a living creature with moods, tempers, and demands. It could be graceful one second and deadly the next. The Bf-109 rewarded precision, but punished mistakes instantly. Every pilot who climbed into its narrow cockpit felt the same mix of awe and fear. The takeoff was the first test. The 109's thin landing gear made it twitchy on the ground, eager to twist and flip if you weren't careful. "It didn't forgive you," one Luftwaffe veteran later said. "You had to fly the Messerschmitt. Never let it fly you." But once airborne, it was like strapping yourself to lightning. The men who mastered it became legends. Erich Hartmann, the Black Devil, scored an unmatched 352 aerial victories, more than any other pilot in history. His secret wasn't aggression. It was patience. Hartmann stalked his prey silently, closing in until his enemy filled the gun sight, then firing a single, perfect burst. His philosophy was simple: see, decide, attack, and then disappear. He called the Bf-109 his steel stallion, claiming that no other aircraft responded as naturally to instinct. Then there was Hans-Joachim Marseille, the star of Africa. Where Hartmann was cold and calculating, Marseille was bold and artistic. Flying the Bf-109F across the blazing skies of North Africa, he destroyed entire formations of Allied fighters with impossible precision. Witnesses said his plane seemed to dance, rolling, looping, striking, and vanishing. In one day, Marseille claimed 17 kills, a record that stunned even his enemies. But not every story ended in glory. Many young pilots were thrown into battle with barely enough training to handle the 109's power. The engine torque could flip the aircraft during takeoff. Landing it on rough fields was a gamble with death. Those who survived described the experience as equal parts thrill and terror. "You felt invincible at altitude," one recalled, "but every mission could be your last." What united them all, veterans and rookies alike, was respect. The 109 demanded absolute focus. It had quirks you learned to love: the heavy nose, the cramped canopy, the howl of the supercharger at high altitude. But it gave something back, a sense that you were part of a machine perfectly designed for combat. Many Allied pilots later admitted that facing a Bf-109 was both terrifying and thrilling. It was an enemy worthy of respect. The Luftwaffe turned these aces into heroes, propaganda icons for a nation hungry for symbols of power. Their faces appeared on posters, their victories broadcast across Europe. But behind the glory was exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that each new mission might be their last. Even decades later, surviving pilots still talk about the 109 not with nostalgia, but with reverence. They call it the fighter that taught you to be humble. Because no matter how skilled you were, the Bf-109 always reminded you that mastery came at a price. But the war wasn't standing still. The Allies were growing stronger, faster, and more organized. And soon, the 109, once the Hunter, would find itself on the other side of the gun sight. By the middle of the war, the skies over Europe were changing, and not in Germany's favor. What had once been the Hunter's domain was now filled with new predators. The Bf-109, the fearsome machine that had ruled the early war skies, was suddenly fighting for survival. The problem wasn't just the enemy, it was time. The 109 had been designed in the mid-1930s when aerial combat was still a duel between small groups of fighters. But by 1943, the sky had become an industrial battlefield. Swarms of American bombers darkened the horizon, escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, aircraft that could fly deeper, higher, and longer than anything the Luftwaffe had. The Bf-109 simply couldn't keep up forever. Its short range, once a minor inconvenience, now became a fatal flaw. German pilots had to fight close to home, limited by fuel that barely got them to the target and back. The Mustang, on the other hand, could chase them across countries. It wasn't a fair fight anymore, and the Luftwaffe knew it. Then there was the issue of production. Germany's factories were under constant bombardment. Replacement parts grew scarce. New pilots were being rushed through training, many with only a few hours in the cockpit before being sent into combat. The Bf-109, which demanded finesse and skill, was now being handed to boys barely old enough to drive. Veterans could feel the difference. The once tight formations grew scattered. The 109, once known for its lethal grace, began to feel sluggish against newer Allied designs. Pilots had to push it harder, diving faster, flying lower, taking risks that often ended in disaster. The machine was still deadly in the hands of an expert, but those experts were disappearing fast, and the Allies had learned. British and American pilots knew the 109's weaknesses: the poor visibility over the nose, the fragile landing gear, the limited fuel. They used every one of those flaws to their advantage. Dogfights became hunts. The 109s that once dominated the air now found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outlasted. Still, there was something almost tragic about its decline. Even as newer German aircraft like the FW-190 began to take over, the 109 refused to fade away. It kept flying, kept fighting, evolving through sheer necessity. Each new variant tried to solve a problem. More armor here, a better engine there, but with every upgrade, it lost a little of the balance that once made it perfect. For Allied pilots, shooting down a 109 was a badge of honor. For German pilots, flying one was an act of loyalty to their comrades, their country, and the legacy of the machine itself. Even as defeat loomed, many swore they'd rather die in a 109 than live in anything else. By the final years of the war, the Messerschmitt was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been, but its legend was sealed, not just because of its victories, but because it refused to surrender to time, technology, or even inevitability. The war would end, but the Bf-109 story didn't, because even in defeat, it earned something far greater than fear. It earned immortality, and that immortality would live on long after the last dogfight. When the war finally ended in 1945, the once invincible Luftwaffe was in ruins. Crashed fighters littered airfields from France to Poland, and among them lay hundreds of battered Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the machines that had once ruled the sky. But even as the dust settled, something remarkable happened. The Bf 109 refused to disappear. Instead, it found a second life. Nations that had been neutral or newly rebuilding snapped up surviving aircraft. Finland, Switzerland, Spain, and even Czechoslovakia put them back into service. Some were rebuilt with different engines, others retrofitted for new missions. The Spanish version, the Hispano HA-1112, kept flying well into the 1960s, decades after its German creators were gone. Ironically, many of those Spanish 109s would later be used in Hollywood films to play the enemy they once were, appearing in movies like The Battle of Britain. But the Bf 109's legacy isn't just about longevity, it's about the mark it left on aviation history. For engineers, it became a blueprint, proof that a fighter didn't need to be massive to be deadly. Its lightweight frame, streamlined design, and high power-to-weight ratio influenced generations of aircraft that came after. Even today, you can trace elements of its DNA in modern fighter design, from tight aerodynamics to the balance between power and maneuverability. For pilots, though, the Bf 109 remains something deeper. It wasn't just a plane you flew, it was a plane that tested you. Those who mastered it never forgot the sensation, the way it shook under full throttle, the whistle of air over the canopy during a dive, the sound of the Daimler-Benz engine roaring like an animal straining against the leash. It was equal parts thrilling and terrifying, and that memory stuck with them for life. Many Allied pilots, even those who fought against it, spoke of the 109 with a kind of reluctant admiration. They respected its design, its agility, and its raw power. Some even admitted that in a one-on-one duel, the Bf 109 was a fighter they'd rather not face. That respect helped solidify its legend, not just as Germany's war machine, but as one of the greatest fighters ever built. And then there's the mythology. Over time, the 109 became a symbol of both genius and tragedy, the embodiment of how far human innovation could go when pushed by obsession, pride, and desperation. It represented the heights of engineering brilliance and the depths of moral darkness. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, a contradiction that still fascinates historians, pilots, and enthusiasts alike. Even today, when surviving Bf 109s appear at air shows, crowds stop and stare. The howl of that old engine still carries a strange, haunting energy, a sound that belongs to another era. Pilots who've flown them in modern times often describe the same feeling. It's alive. You don't fly it, you negotiate with it. That's the secret to its endurance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 isn't just remembered because it was deadly. It's remembered because it meant something, a symbol of fear, power, and human ambition that still commands awe 80 years later. But there's one last question, one that keeps historians and pilots debating even now. Was the Bf 109 truly the best, or just the most feared? The answer lies not in its victories, but in what it came to represent after the war was over. In the end, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was more than a fighter plane. It was a paradox, a machine that symbolized both human brilliance and human darkness. It soared higher, faster, and longer than anyone thought possible, but it was born from a world preparing for destruction. It was the weapon of a regime that sought dominance, yet its engineering became timeless, studied, admired, and feared long after the smoke cleared. From the dusty skies of Spain to the frozen fronts of Russia, from the deserts of North Africa to the stormy clouds over Britain, the 109 was there, a constant presence in nearly every major air battle of the early war. It evolved alongside the conflict, from sleek predator to desperate defender, adapting to every new challenge until there was nothing left to give. It was not just a witness to history, it shaped it. But what truly made it legendary wasn't its kill count or its technology. It was the way it changed the men who flew it. For pilots, the Bf 109 was a test of courage and skill, a teacher that punished weakness but rewarded mastery. Every takeoff was a gamble, every landing a small miracle. Those who survived spoke of it like a living being, temperamental, dangerous, but magnificent. It demanded respect, and it gave back glory, at least for a while. And even for those who fought against it, the Bf 109 left a lasting impression. Allied pilots admitted that when they saw that angular silhouette slicing through the clouds, their instincts screamed to be ready, because they were up against something extraordinary. In a war filled with chaos, the 109 stood out as a symbol of order, precision, and deadly efficiency. Today, more than 80 years later, its legend still flies. Restored 109s roar across the skies at air shows, their engines echoing like ghosts of another time. Historians still debate its place among the greats. Was it truly superior to the Spitfire or the Mustang? Was it the best or just the most feared? But maybe that's the wrong question, because what made the Bf 109 unforgettable wasn't perfection. It was presence. It dominated its era, defined the look and sound of air combat, and set the standard by which all fighters were measured. Its design was the blueprint for modern aviation, its spirit the heartbeat of a generation of pilots who learned what it meant to fly on the edge of survival. When the last engine fell silent and the world moved on, the legend of the 109 remained, not as a relic, but as a reminder. A reminder of how innovation and obsession can blur the line between creation and destruction, of how even the most feared machines can inspire awe long after their wars are over. And that's why, even today, pilots still talk about it. Not because it was perfect, but because it mattered. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 didn't just conquer the sky, it became the sky, the symbol of an age when courage, fear, and machine became one.